Hello guys and welcome to another chapter in the administrative law series, and today we are going to learn about delegated legislation. In the last chapter we learnt about the separation of powers, wherein the three branches of the government function independently and separately. Therefore, according to this separation of powers, the legislature will perform the duty of rule making, whereas the executive will perform the duty of administering the law. So according to this, each section or each branch is already given its power it is to be served. Then what is the point of delegated legislation? The whole concept of the delegated legislation was not into picture until the 20th century. By delegated legislation, all it meant was that the executive, which is actually the power which administers or executes, was given the power of rule making. That means that the executive took the power, or moreover was delegated the power of the legislature, which was of the power of rule making. Therefore, the term delegated legislation. Now, according to MP Jain, the delegated legislation, the word delegated legislation can be taken in two senses. The first sense is with regard to exercise the legislative power by the subordinate agents, and secondly, when the subordinate authority themselves make the rules and regulation by the guidance and the power conferred by the authority. Therefore, in the first case we can see that there is an agent, there is a subordinate agent who himself conducts the legislative function. So in the second one we can see that a subordinate body, he himself makes subordinate rules. So he basically is making rules of his level. So what happens is, in the second case we can see that he is making such rules under the guidance of the legislative authority. Now, under delegated legislation, we can see three forms of delegated legislation. The first one is the statutory instrument. Now, according to the statutory instrument, it is formed by the government itself. Now the second one is the bylaws. Now the bylaws are the ones which are created by the local authorities with the approval of the parliament, as the parliament may not always have time for local issues. And the third one is the order in council, wherein the laws are made whenever the laws are required by the society. The best example for this is the Nirbhaya Act of 2013 or the Criminal Amendment Act of 2013, which was made during the time where the amendment for the punishments of the rapes were required for the most. In the case of Chandra Bhan and others versus state of UP, it was held that the delegated legislation must be reasonable and should not be suffered from unreasonableness. Now there are many reasons as to why the delegated legislation actually had a growth in the modern society. Now first and foremost, it grew because of the time constraint. As we know that the legislature themselves have a lot of functions to perform on day-to-day and everyday basis. So what happens in such a case is minute or the smaller issues which can be solved by the local government. The best example for this is the bylaws, which are passed by the local government and then approved by the parliament. Second reason for the growth are the technical matters. The parliament may not always be experts with regards to various technical matters, and in such a case it becomes more feasible for the parliament to delegate their powers to the authorities which are expert in the matters, just to save a lot of time and their energy. So this in turn makes it very flexible for the parliament to conduct their duties towards the more important issues properly. When a new law is introduced to a new society, it opens rooms for experiment. Now what happens in such a case is, when a law or when an act is introduced to a smaller region, it helps us to understand how the society or how the law will react to such a new act. Now delegated legislation becomes an important asset during the time of emergency. Now during the time of emergency, it's very difficult for the legislation to look into the matters of the subordinate level. So what happened during such a case is that the subordinate agents can themselves make the rules and then pass the rules as per required. So basically during emergency, it helps the subordinate agents to take quick decisions with regards to the important matters. And the last reason as to why there is a growth of delegated legislation is because during the modern times, delegated legislation is considered to be as very convenient for the functioning of the government. Now let's look at some of the classifications of the delegated legislation. The first class of delegated legislation is known as the title-based delegated legislation. This may be as per the rules, regulations or bylaw, etc. The second delegated legislation is known as the discretion based delegated legislation. In this delegated legislation, this is where the executive receives a conferred discretion to make a certain act. So the discretion is given on the basis of that act, and therefore the discretion is given to the executive body. Next is the purpose based delegated legislation. Now according to this purpose based delegated legislation, the legislature delegates the power to the executive to perform or to serve certain purpose. Next is the authority based delegated legislation. Now according to this authority based delegated legislation, it is also known as the subdelegation. In this case, the legislative authority itself, the legislative authority himself or itself will appoint a subordinate authority to do its duty. Now lastly, let's look into some of the criticism with regards to delegated legislation. So what happens when the three powers, that is the legislative, executive and the judiciary, all these three powers mix, or in this case, in the case of delegated legislation, mixes up with each other? It is obviously opposed to the rules of separation of powers, as according to separation of powers, all these three branches of the government will function independently and separately. So when the function of the legislative is taken by the executive, it is obvious that there is some sort of mix up which is happening, or some sort of exchange of powers which is happening in both of the organs of the government, and therefore what happens is this completely disregards the rule of separation of power. Therefore in the United States of America or the USA, the delegated legislation is not actually followed. As in USA, it is observed that there is a strict separation of the branches of the government. Moreover, in the state of USA, there is another saying which goes as per this maxim, which states that the delegated power which is already delegated cannot be further delegated. Now what does this mean is that the legislature or the rule making power in the United States, as we have seen in our last video, is given to the Congress, and this Congress is appointed by the people. So it is already said that the people who appoint the Congress, therefore the people has already delegated the powers to the Congress. So in such a case, when the powers have been already delegated to the Congress, it cannot be further delegated. Therefore this is another case why this is another situation as to why USA do not follow the delegated legislation. Moreover, as the legislative power is given in the hands of the executive, in such a case it is not very certain as to when the delegation will be given and when it will not be given. Therefore what happens in such a case is it creates a lot of uncertainty, as there is no rules or regulation with regards to delegated legislation. Since there is no rules or regulation, proper regulation with regards to the delegated legislation, what happens in such case is that the whole scenario changes as per the government changes or as per the parties of the country changes. Delegated legislation themselves do not gel well with the rule of law. And the last criticism with regards to the delegated legislation is that when a legislature, the power of legislature is given to the power of the executive branch, what this makes is that even though it lessens the burden of the legislature, it gives more power to the executive, which is usually not doing the duty of the legislature, that is the rule making body, as the duty or the function of the executive is to administer law. So what happens in such a case is that the executive gets more power or gets dual power of that of administering the law as well as rule making. So what happens is that the executive themselves will become more stronger than the legislative. Now lastly, let's look into the case of A.K. Roy versus Union of India. In this case, the Supreme Court held that the executive has the power to bring the act into force, and it should not be excessively delegated the power of the legislation. So when you're delegating the power of the legislation, it should be made sure that the power are not excessively delegated. So what happens when you excessively delegate the power, you're making the executive stronger than the legislation. So that's all for today's video, guys. I'll see you all in the next video. Bye.